School buses have been moved. Can somebody confirm that, please? Along with the blue Mazda blocking the area that we're taking our picture in a couple hours. So in reconvening, our next agenda item is with respect to consent-based negotiations in the Broughton Archipelago by Gulagame, Mike 23.
Lots of chatter. Good afternoon, delegates. Just want to welcome everybody back after lunch. I want to present to you a brief update on the letter of understanding work that our First Nation, the Numgis First Nation.
Could we wrap up conversations, please, chiefs and delegates, guests? Could you wrap up your conversations, please? Thank you.
Would like to provide an update to this table concerning the letter of understanding work that the Kwikwasutinu-Kwikwatmis First Nation, the Mamalilakla First Nation, and the Numgis First Nation have been pursuing in relationship to the upcoming tenure renewals for the fish farms in the Broughton Archipelago area. Now, as I've reported previously, there were a good number of occurrences that happened all one after the other, and it created a very good, perfect storm, if you like, to get the government's attention in terms of dealing with the impacts of fish farms to wild salmon. And what we witnessed last summer, the breakup of the Washington State fish farm and the escape of hundreds of thousands of fish, the land defenders of our people that took occupation of a number of fish farms in our territories, the emergence of DFO genome science offering clarity on the Piscine Rio virus and its transferability from Atlantic salmon to Pacific salmon. And then finally, the Auditor General report of Canada, which really came down hard on the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in terms of how it has failed, utterly failed to look after wild salmon and protect them from the disease transfer and the potential disease transfer to Pacific salmon. And so when this came about, we had a meeting in the big house in Alert Bay. That was back in October, and we had Premier Horgan, Minister Popham, Minister Fraser, and one other minister that escapes my mind right now. Thank you. RMLA, Claire Trevena, Minister. And so it began a very unique presentation to the government. And what I mean by that is at that time we had the Tawadeno First Nation were part of this group as well. And we presented to the government a group of First Nations that had in principle had come to terms with the overlap and shared territory. And we had united very clearly on this issue of getting fish farms out of our territories. And not only that, but we presented ourselves united as councils, the elected councils of our nations, as well as the hereditary chiefs of our collective nations. And so in my mind, that took away the question the government would consider about, are you the appropriate title holder to be speaking to this issue? And so we removed that question we removed the opportunity to focus on overlaps, and we were able to get a table with the government to enact their commitment to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And so that was followed up with a meeting in January where we had Minister Fraser, Minister Donaldson, oh gosh, in our language it's Gichomas is when your canoe drifts away, so that just happened. So we had a number of ministers and we agreed to have a UN DRIP, free, prior and informed consent, shared decision-making process in relationship to the renewal of the tenures. And so when that occurred, we were able to sit down with representatives from our nations as well as representatives at the Assistant Deputy Minister level. And we were able to begin to formulate what a process could look like that we both held the pen. And so we jointly developed a process based on some principles and guided by the UN Declaration as a means to enact free, prior, and informed consent. And as you've probably heard many times now, that the consultation and accommodation process is entirely held within the Crown's authority, where they decide how it's going to be, they decide the weight of information, they ultimately make the decision on whatever topic they're consulting on. And so by having the letter of understanding guide the work in relationship to the fish farm tenures, we were able to design a process that acknowledged our Aboriginal title and rights. It acknowledged the inherent authorities that we have in our territories. And I felt this was rather significant given the experience that the Leadership Council had with the previous government, where they avoided the word inherent jurisdiction and authority like the plague. And so by having this current government with its commitment to the UN Declaration, we were able to get a place where our authorities were recognized, that the governance structures that we have, both elected and traditional leadership, had a meaningful place in shaping outcomes. And so as we went down this road, we started to develop this process, and there was a press release, and the letter of understanding is in your kits in tab 5. I believe it's tab 5, is that right? In the fisheries tab. And so you can see for yourself and study the details of what we've accomplished. And so now that we've gone forward with the work based upon that, we had originally set a 90-day time frame to accomplish the work. And the reason and rationale for that was because we didn't want it to be a forever in 3 days kind of process, which leads to status quo fish farm operation in our territories. And for your understanding, the reason our First Nations have taken such a strong stand on this particular industry is because this industry represents the greatest threat to the wild salmon in our territories. I can tell you that what is known as Bond Sound, which is Ata in our way, had a return of just over 500 pink salmon last year. And so this is a river with a very specific genetic comprised of a very unique genetic salmon run on the verge of extinction. And so for us, we've been in opposition to this industry since it arrived. We've watched the decline of our salmon stocks. We've watched denial of industry, the support of government in that denial of the impacts, and then all the roosters came home at once. And so now we've got the evidence that supports what we've known all along. And so as we go forward, we're enacting this joint process with 90 days. You may have noticed that we've just granted an extra 60 days to do the work. And what happened is, as we began to face scheduling issues and the amount of details that were provided to our steering committee, we realized that to give it fulsome consideration and to have well thought out recommendations going forward, we needed just a little bit more time. Now, one of the things that I've learned, because obviously being a First Nation elected leader like many of us here, our focus has always been and continues to be on current Aboriginal case law in Canada. And that is the beginning of our struggles. with the government. And so what we found, though, in this process, I started to learn things about administrative law, something that I'd never turned my attention to. And inside administrative law is a concept of administrative fairness. And so since that these are tenures that are intended to be renewed, that we had to create space to engage with the industry. And the details that we learned, we will inform the recommendations that we go forward with. And so as we've gone down the road and we started to learn bits and pieces of their operations, we had to spend some more time considering the implications of all of that information on the recommendations. So I want to highlight a couple things that are found in the letter of understanding, and I'll try to be as quick as I can. But in the context 2.2, it says, pursuant to their laws, customs, and traditions, the Aboriginal peoples represented by the First Nations hold and exercise Aboriginal title, rights, responsibilities, and authorities in relation to the land, waters, resources, and peoples of their territories. So you can see that's where I mentioned where the government has recognized that we have title in our territories. And the next section, these title, rights, responsibilities, and authorities are advanced by elected and hereditary leadership of the Aboriginal peoples represented by the First Nations. The First Nations laws, customs, and traditions include sacred responsibilities to past, present, and future generations, including the lands, waters, and resources on which their food security, societies, and culture depend. And so when we think about these words, we know very well that in the UN Declaration it talks about the need of food security. And so this is where we then look at what does salmon mean to our people beyond a food source. It becomes a very big part of who we are as people. The traditions that we have in relationship to harvesting, the traditions that we have of mentoring our young people to continue the use and respect of the sacred resource, and what salmon means to each of our exercise of our culture. And I know culture of our people is not up for debate. It's not up for debate with anybody, let alone the Crown, because that's who we are as people, and that is not something that can be compromised. It must be protected and upheld. In section 2.9, it mentions, while the article of UN DRIP benefits from being read comprehensively and without restriction, the application of UN DRIP to the work under this letter of understanding. So what I recall back to the meeting we had in January, and we were unfortunate we didn't have microphones, and it was a really large table. And my elder, Bill Wasden, was sitting beside me, and he asked each of us to stand up and speak when we spoke, so everybody could hear. And so Minister Fraser and I, we looked like we were on a seesaw as we're going back and forth. He'd stand up and speak, I'd stand up and speak. And where he wanted to go was free, prior, informed. And then I would stand up and say, you forgot the word consent. And he said, well, we're prepared for free, prior, and informed. And I said, well, you forgot the word consent. And then I reminded him what I understand and what's found that I just read out is you can't pick the pieces of the UN DRIP you like. It's about the intention of the overall document as a minimum set of human rights standards for Indigenous people here. And so we were able to get the government to accept that and put that into the letter of understanding. And 2.11, the First Nations require that the fish farms be removed from their territories given their conclusions regarding the harmful effect on and risks to the ecosystem, including the waters, lands, and resources, including migratory resources in the territories, and the adverse impact fish farms on their Aboriginal rights, including title. And 2.12, you can see there that it talks about a jointly defined consent-based process. And so that's where we were able to ensure that when we arrive at recommendations, those recommendations go from the steering committee and they go to who we choose on our side of the table to approve. And for the Kwekwe First Nation, that is a table of our hereditary leadership. And so what we're doing is wanting to move beyond the confines of an Indian Act Band Council and demonstrate to ourselves that we can do things differently than we have for decades. and to demonstrate to our people that indeed the elected and the traditional leadership can come together and work together and reach a common goal, so we can then, with the other work we're doing down the hallway about reestablishing our traditional governance system. And then on page 3, 3.1b, best efforts be made to reach consensus recommendations in a timely and efficient manner. Discussions will be respectful with the aim of upholding reconciliation. And so when we include that, it was about a focus of being able to address the impacts that we know. So we understand that part of the discussions that we have yet to cover are about the rehabilitation of the salmon runs in the Broughton Archipelago. And the one that I am really happy to report to the table here is 3.1d, because it states the precautionary principle will guide the government-to-government process. Now, I have yet to meet a First Nation leader that has said to me that they think DFO has done a wonderful job in enacting the precautionary principle in relationship to salmon or other fisheries. So we felt that it was very important that this be in there, so the precautionary principle based upon our participation is based upon our traditions, our values, our cultures, and the principles of looking after our territories. And then also point 3.1g essentially says this process is not going to be a debate on science. And so with it not being a debate on science, there was an acceptance that this industry represents an impact to wild salmon in the environment. So we didn't get into an endless argument about their science, our science, your science, gray science, because that's the reality that has perpetuated this industry and allowed it to continue. And it is also, looking at page 4, letter J, it says, without predetermining the sufficiency of such accommodation, consent-based recommendations resulting from the G2G process that are adopted by the parties may be considered as potential contributions to accommodation. I'm not sure, there's so many points I want to read out, but I'm also mindful of time. And so the document is there for you to have a look at. The one thing I need to report to you, at the outset, we had the participation of the Taodeno First Nation. And at the beginning, when the government sat down and they said, geez, you know, here's our initial ideas. But in order for us as a table to hear their initial thoughts on the whole aquaculture path and how that would be presented to our table, they required us to sign non-disclosure agreements. And the contents of what was not able to be disclosed became the broader public policy announcement later by the government. But at that time, with the want of transparency and accountability back to community members, the Taodeno First Nation made the decision not to participate any further because they were really uncomfortable with the aspect of non-disclosure. And since then, they have also made a further choice to pursue Aboriginal title to their lands. And so what that leaves us with then is the Numgis, the Mamalilak, the Kwekwasuntinuuk, and the Kwapmis First Nations. And so we go forward. We have a very short time frame now left in front of us. And I remain confident, and I know many of you have heard me articulate our dissatisfaction with various governments and processes in this industry. But I can tell you this, that I'm still at that table. And I wouldn't be there if I didn't believe there was going to be an outcome that would be beneficial for the wild salmon of our territories. And of course, when I encourage everybody to dust off the Cohen Commission and give that a read again, especially Fraser River First Nations and Thompson River First Nations, because it articulates that there is a potential irreversible disease transfer to your salmon from the Fraser as they go by these farms. And so this then, in my mind, when I think of current case law, is that it represents a potential impact to your Aboriginal rights, a potential infringement to your rights. And so that triggers the duty to consult by the government. And so this is something I've been alerting nations all across BC because the migratory nature of salmon smolt specifically can connect dots, connect river systems like dots, from the Fraser to the Discovery Channel area, to the Broughton Archipelago, up to the Central Coast and to the Skeena and the Nass. And so this is one of the reasons why I've been so adamant about getting this information out, is because I know without question the value that wild salmon means to First Nations across British Columbia. So there's one thing I want to mention is a week ago or a week and a half ago, we as the Leadership Council pulled together a wild salmon summit for 3 days. And the rationale for that, because there were some resources available from Indigenous Services Canada to the Leadership Council for projects. And so we gathered as many First Nation fisheries organizations to come and present about the work that they do from the technical side, to speak about the priorities and the strategies they have. And so the idea, the initial concept was for leadership to receive all this information and then say, well, what about this? Or what about that? And so we could then do like a gap analysis, if you like, about where we need to strengthen our focus to protect wild salmon across British Columbia. And wanting to be able to see developed a province-wide political strategy to advance the protection of wild salmon. And the timeliness of it, I think, is really well. And I say that because the provincial government has a salmon steering committee, and that includes a good number of First Nations people from all across the coast and up the interior as well. And so their strategy for a strategy is going to come out of that process in November. And I've heard also that DFO is intending to come out sometime about the same time with their plans on the wild salmon policy, which this Liberal government committed to implement. And so with these two provincial and federal governments coming forward with the thoughts of wild salmon, we felt it was a good idea to bring together a concise, strategic, integrated, I'm starting to sound like a government official now. I know, okay. Mention salmon, this is what happens. But we want to have a really nice, tight political advancement of wild salmon across the province. And so we can advance that to the governments and to ensure that there's a strong voice. And I've thought about it, and part of the reason for wanting this province-wide strategy is so we can better understand and respect one another and the needs that we have in our river systems. And so there isn't $10 put on the table and we all squabble and fight over it, but we can begin to understand and develop a broader policy or a broader approach which benefits all of us. And I'll use our territory as an example. Because of the depleted wild salmon stocks, we've left them alone for a very long time because we don't want to be the ones to catch the last salmon. But what that means then is we turn our attention to migratory stocks, which are the Fraser River. And so what I've thought about, and our people have spoken of, if we could rejuvenate the river systems in our territories, it would lessen the stress and impact on Fraser River stocks, because then we could fish in our territories, which would then make more fish available for escapement. And one of the things that I heard quite clearly spoken of at the Wild Salmon Summit is the allocation model that the Department of Fisheries and Oceans have. They've got it backwards, where we know that the Sparrow decision was very clear that it was going to be conservation needs, First Nation needs, and then everybody else. But that's not the way in practice. And so that's one of the messages that we'll be putting forward. And so, you know, I want to thank Hazel, our elder, for speaking earlier. You nailed it. Unity, where we need to be able to come together. And we need to find that unity. And you've heard me speak before. My son's mother is Intlekatmik. I'm tied together with the Intlekatmik people. I have family ties with the Nuchanols. My partner has ties with the Okanagan Nation Alliance and the Tla'amin people. And I would really want us to focus on the way that we're tied together as a starting point and let that feed up into the political systems where we can see we are one people And we do need that united voice to advance the needs of all of us, not at the expense of others. And make use of this opportunity within the provincial government on the commitment document. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, it seems like the federal opportunity window is closed as they get ready for the election coming up. I really want to thank Coldwater, Chief Spahan, for having your children come and be here to witness this gathering. And it's always a wonderful reminder when we have children and youth in our meetings, because that's why we do the work. We hope that they will have a better experience than each of us have had, and that the engagement, and when they step up into leadership and become the substantial component of community, that they are able to realize the proper place in this country for First Nations people. And lastly, I want to do a bit of a public service announcement for a very dear friend of mine. And he's someone that is not a stranger to any leadership across British Columbia. I'm talking about Wade Grant from the Musqueam First Nation. Now, we all know Wade. We know the honor and the integrity that he carries every day of his life. But what you may not know is Wade has made the decision to run as an independent councillor on the Vancouver City Council. And I really applaud and support Wade for what he's doing. The integrity he has demonstrated to all of us has never wavered. And to know that we're going to have an articulate First Nation man that's going to be sitting on, well, we're all hoping and of course supporting him to become a successful councillor, but it's about First Nation leadership getting involved in places that we haven't been to inform people of our struggle. And I absolutely support Wade Grant in that effort. And Wade wanted me to pass on a special hello to all the chiefs here. He's sad that he could not be here to pass it along himself, but he wants to thank each and every one of you for the integrity, strength, and wisdom that you've brought to his attention by your actions and leadership. And so I just wanted to share that with you, that one of our own is pursuing something that is really incredible, and I'm really, really supportive of him. And so, Mr. Chair, I tried to be as succinct as possible. Thank you.
Keela Kessler Galagame. In being so succinct, unfortunately you didn't leave any time for questions or comments, so we're moving on. A couple of housekeeping things though. If you missed lunch, or if you took a little bit less so that the lunch could spread out a little bit more, there's a bunch of BLT and ham and cheese sandwiches in the back table there, along with Timbits. So if you're hungry, there's lots of food there. As well, if you have a black Ford, a Toyota 4Runner, or a white Dodge SUV, go out and take a look to make sure it's not blocking the preschool bus path. What do you say, Bob? So inviting forward Hewis, Chief Warren Paul, Jasmine Paul, and Roseanne Kyle to give an update on the Shishal BC agreement. Come forward to my left over here, please. Oh, how many are there? Yep. Say it again. In camera? For this portion of the presentation, we're going to go in camera, so you can confirm the web